Okay with you?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay. It's going.
All right.
Okay.
So the first question that we had, and we can just alternate or whatever, and you guys can both answer, is when and where were you born?
San Francisco,
Okay.
1958.
Okay, awesome.
I was born in the southern tip of Illinois in 1952.
And then our next question is, how long have you lived in this particular area?
I've lived here 44 years.
Okay. And what brought you up here?
It's a bit of a long story, but Sharon and I had just been married. We were going to head west. We were hoping to go to Idaho. I was thinking about going back to grad school in forestry, and they had a good forestry school there.
Mm-hmm.
And we had just put the last suitcase in my wife's car. We were at my parents'. We were going to spend the last night there, leave early the next morning, and the phone rang.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a lady from Missoula, Montana, wanting to interview Sharon for a teaching position. We looked on the map, go, well, we're going right through Missoula on our way to Idaho. We'll stop. If she gets the job, we'll stay. If not, we'll keep going to Idaho. And she got the job.
Awesome.
Both of us were raised in the country and didn't really like living in town, so every weekend we'd go in a different direction, looking around and all that, and somebody said we should come up to the Swan Valley. It sounds like our kind of place. And when we did, we just fell in love with it immediately. We bought land like 2 weeks later. It took us a couple years to actually get up here, but we've been up here ever since, pretty much. So.
Awesome. And then how about you?
I've been here 40 years, and I'm not really sure how I got here. I went to school in Missoula, college in Missoula, and then I was working for DNRC out of Sealy.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine had property in Condon. That's how I discovered, because I was just camping out. So I started camping on his property, and
In your teepee, right?
in my teepee.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
And then I got a job here locally, working for Rustics, which used to be a big log home manufacturing company that employed a lot of people here.
And this was their office building.
Yeah,
at the
this was
time.
their office.
Oh, cool.
And then just kind of bought property, bought a house, figured out a way to. I've been lucky with employment. I worked for the Forest Service, Swan Ecosystem Center. I have a pet sitting business, and then my work with Living with Wildlife Foundation.
Awesome. And that kind of leads right into the next question is, like, what has been, like, your livelihood while you've been in Condon? Like, what have you been up to, I guess?
Whatever comes my way.
Yeah, that's why a lot of us are that way. Because Sharon and I, she was the school teacher, but I was willing to do, if she could find a job teaching, I would get whatever I could. Again, I worked with the Forest Service for 17 seasons.
Steve and I were on the same crew.
Yeah.
Oh.
And I worked for an outdoor program. It was a drug and alcohol rehab center that used an outward bound portion to go into the mountains. So I ran the outdoor portion of that, spent a lot of time in the Bob Marshall Glacier, Yellowstone, places like that. Worked 10 years at Northwest Connections, which is a conservation education organization. Them and the Swan Ecosystem Center went together a few years ago into one organization. But I worked at Rustics for a little bit to learn how to build my own log home, because it's something I always wanted to do and did. I had my own rustic furniture business for a little bit. I don't know. I've done a carpentry, just whatever, a hunting guide. I've done a lot of different things.
And a lot of people that have been here in the same kind of era that Steve and I moved here as, young adults. If we're still here, many of us have bought our property, and our houses, and due to the economy have had to leave the valley, or at least I had to leave for a while and go somewhere where I could earn a savings account and move back here. And many of us that are about my age have come and had to leave but never sold our property or a house and came back. And you just do what you have to do to stay because
Yeah.
you love it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then what is like the most prominent industry in this area, like historically and present time? Like what are some things that come to mind when you think about it?
Well, there's been a number of things here in the valley through the years. One of the problems the early homesteaders had, there was very limited way to make money here in the valley when they first came up. Trapping was one, and it was lucrative back in those days.
Mhm.
And some of the homesteaders, that's probably how they made it, is because they could trap. A lot of them had to leave the valley to work in lumber mills like Bonner and places like that, or different logging things going on around. A lot of them would raise at least a few milk cows, and they could sell the cream to the Missoula Creamery.
Mm-hmm.
And the postmaster guy that came up delivering the mail 2 days a week in those early years, he would actually pick up the cans of cream, take them down, and that would give the homesteaders just a little bit of money. It wasn't real lucrative, but it was enough to get some basics and that sort of thing. And the guy that was running the post office route would often shop for him also.
Oh.
So he'd not only take the cream down, he'd do a little bit of shopping and then bring it back up on one of the next mail runs and stuff. The logging and timber industry got big time right after World War II. There was a big demand for lumber and that sort of thing. And I guess before, during, and after that, the outfitting business was a major player here in the valley, going into the Bob Marshall Wilderness primarily, but also some here in the valley, a little bit in the missions and all that. But so outfitting, outdoor recreation, those sort of things. There's not as much logging and all that as there used to be. There's still a little bit, and there's still a little bit of outfitting. Both of those have gone down. It seemed like more in the valley now, it's a lot of retirement. I mean, our school has, I think, like 28 kids from K through 8.
Wow.
So we don't have very many young couples in the valley, but that sort of thing. What else, Kathy?
Well, when Rustics was here,
Oh, yeah. the
I would
Waterhole.
say that for the younger people like me and Steve moving into the valley at the time, that was a huge employer in the valley.
The Rustics used to employ up to 100 people doing the various functions,
Wow. Okay.
both here in
So
the office. The
They'd
log
build
yard.
log shells and ship them out. So my job for Rustics was I was their scaler, so I'd go out in the woods and choose which logs we wanted to buy, mark them as house logs, and then they'd, come to the yard, and I'd measure them for their board feet, and then I'd get all the house plans and cut the logs to length and send them down to the crews. I think we had, when it was booming, 6 to 8, 5-man crews. So it was a big employer for this valley for, a 10-year boom maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
Plum Creek employed a lot of people here, but Plum Creek divested of all their timber, and that was a whole nother thing, the Montana Legacy Project, which both Steve and I were working for organizations that were trying to solidify that deal.
And
With many other organizations.
Forest Service was a pretty good employer here, especially in the early years, and then even up through when we worked with them and all that. The little station down here had lots of people working out of it. Even before that, the old Condon Ranger Station, which is a historic place down the road a ways and off on Condon Loop Road, but they actually had a ranger station there with people that lived there year round and that sort of thing. It was a big presence, whereas now through consolidations and things, most all of it happens out of Bigfort now. Occasionally people are down here working, but it's not used to employ quite a few people, at least on a seasonal basis. And it was big for the homesteaders. In 1910 was when there was a really big forest fire that came through Montana, Idaho, and places, and burned like 3 million acres and killed at least 85 people. Well, after that, the Forest Service, the National thought on it. We can't let that happen again. So the Forest Service went from a very small organization to a much larger, and they started hiring homesteaders here in the valley to help build trails, lookouts, man the lookouts, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. So, and for the homesteaders, that was a big deal because they no longer had to leave the valley, a lot of them, to try to find employment. They could actually
Just
live
stay
here
here.
and work here. So that was a big plus as far as people being able to prove up on their homesteads.
Going to town up, when did the highway come in? 1960?
61 was when it was finished.
So
They
that's
built it in
really a
stages.
pretty new highway. It was
Yeah.
tough getting to town in the
Yeah.
old days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. The early days when the homesteaders were just horse and wagon, it was up to 5 days to get here from Missoula.
Wow.
Later, things got improved. Roads got it was gravel roads, dirt roads, all of that. But but it was still a long time. If somebody was going to town, it was an all-day event type of thing. It wasn't like now, an hour and a half you're there and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So, and most of the old timers talked about when the highway and the power came in, they kind of came in together. That was the big change here. Because
okay.
before that, it was a real isolated community and all of that, and then and somewhat limited economically. But once the highway was in, it opened up. It just made it more.
Yeah, like present.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Possibilities.
Yeah.
We also wanted to ask about some of like the big memorable events that happened in Swan Valley.
I think one of them in 1908, they called it the Swan Massacre. There's a sign on the highway down by the Gordon Ranch, a big road sign there that kind of explains a lot of it. But the Native Americans on the other side of the mountains here, part of the Hellgate Treaty was this area they could hunt in and stuff like that. Well, in 1908, there was a game warden that seemed to be pretty racist against Indians. And anyway, he kind of got into it, and we've got a book in here, The Gathering Place, we wrote a few years ago. There's a whole chapter in it that the Ponderay wrote for us, and it explains all of it. But essentially, 4 of the guys that were Native American got killed by the game warden. The game warden was wounded by one of them, but he was trying to get up and he was going to start to shoot the women, and one of the women walked up and finished him off. So he died and 4 Native Americans died. But that was a big switch for the natives at that point, because after that happened, they thought there was going to be a lot of retribution against them, so they were afraid to come off the reservation for a while. And they still hunted here, but not nearly as much, and then that kind of almost fizzled out over time and stuff like that. But that was kind of a big moment. Another big one, I think, for the valley was just the Forced Homestead Act of 1906. That opened up. This land up here was checkerboarded. It was either Forest Service land or Northern Pacific, most of it, except for like the Gordon Ranch and a few early homesteads. But most of it was checkerboard. You could homestead Forest Service land, but you couldn't homestead Northern Pacific. But you could buy Northern Pacific land. It was $1.25 an acre. You had to buy about 160 acres. That was a lot of money for most people back in those days. But when this opened up to when they finally got things surveyed so they knew what was Forest Service and what was Northern Pacific, that was around 1914. By 1916, 1917 was the big influx of all the homesteaders. There were some before that, some after that, but the big brunt of it was right then. And that was because things had been surveyed. Now you could say, okay, I'm standing on Forest Service land. The land also, even though it was Forest Service, it had to have agricultural potential. And a lot of people in the Forest Service didn't think that was really doable up in this country. We had very long winters, very rocky soils. Everything was pretty much timbered from mountains to mountains and everything in between. The only thing that wasn't timber was the wet meadows and marshy areas and stuff like that. But in order to prove up, you had to put 20 acres into agriculture out of your 160 or 120, whatever your allotment size was. And most of them had a hard time doing that. They did drain the marshy areas. They tried growing a few crops. Not real good success. and they ended up just growing hay, putting 20 acres into hay. And a lot of them, even though they were trying real hard, they wasn't making a lot of headway. And then the government came up where you could apply for a hardship case. Like, I've been really working my buns off, but I'm just not getting there. You had 5 years to do it.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of them, even though they've been working really hard, they wasn't anywhere close to having 20 acres into agriculture. So they could apply under this hardship case, and a lot of times, and the Forest Service kind of oversaw all of this. They'd inspect all these homesteads every year, and and they could kind of tell if this person's been really working hard at it, and still is not quite to the 20 acres, and this person hadn't been doing much of anything. They'd mostly just been living away. Then you would go in front of a board, and a board would determine, like, okay, you've been trying really hard, we'll waive that 20-acre thing, and as soon as the president signs the homestead, or the deed, I guess, whatever you would call it, then it becomes yours and all of that. But all the homesteads here that did prove up, they have whoever was president did sign the bottom line on them. So.
Interesting.
I think our last question was just, you were talking about protecting the bears in this area.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were very interested in what you've done exactly to protect them.
Well,
What you've done. I
Yeah.
loved your story on the phone. So.
we're fortunate to have grizzly bears here, and I think about 12, 13 years ago, we had a huge loss in this valley, like 8 bears in one season between May and September.
Yeah.
A few of them were poached, some were hit by car, and the rest were management moved from, euthanized because they were becoming food conditioned.
Yeah.
So Swan Ecosystem Center and Northwest Connections, we kind of started a thing called Swan Valley Bear Resources, and we're able to supply all the businesses in the valley with bear-resistant dumpsters, because the businesses, the stores and cafes had a real garbage problem, and there's no easy way to get rid of garbage up here. So, and that was a pretty expensive undertaking, but we were able to fund that, and then it's since grown where we were able to fund people, private residents, to have bear-resistant garbage containers, just what you can put in the back of your pickup and take to the dump, or the local hauler or Republic can pick up. So things were moving pretty good, and then 2 years ago, I worked for Swan Ecosystem Center for about 11 years, I think. And then I left Swan Ecosystem Center and started my pet sitting business. But I've always engaged still with the bears and volunteer for bear work and things like that. They're just a passion of mine. So about 2 years ago, we lost a sow and her 3 cubs of the year that almost everybody in this valley saw. And people sometimes are afraid to call the bear specialists if they're having bear get into their garbage, because they think that first they'll get in trouble, second that the bear will die, which isn't necessarily true. The sooner you can tell a bear manager that you've had a bear get in your garbage and actually be successful and get a food reward, that's not first thing on their mind to kill the bear.
No.
First thing on their mind is, okay, let's try and talk to all your neighbors, things like that, and get you situated either with electricity or bear-resistant containers, give you a little, advice on garden, don't feed birds, things like that. So more and more people are using the campgrounds, and the Forest Service just doesn't have the money to patrol the campgrounds. And because I do a lot of back road driving, doing my pet sitting work, I was stopping at these campgrounds, and because I'd see a bear, or because I'm like, I just want to see what's, I haven't been down here this road in a while, I want to see what's going on. So I saw a real need for a Forest Service presence at those campgrounds, because there, people, you think you throw your orange peel out the window and it's cool because it's biodegradable and all that, but that's not necessarily the case. So I last summer partnered up with the Forest Service and an organization called Living with Wildlife Foundation, and I hit all the campgrounds from Lindbergh Lake. It's about a 34-mile distance, Lindbergh Lake, up to it's called Blair Flats, and there's maybe 8 little, either big campground, big like 15 spots or more, or little roadside or end of the road fishing areas. So I clean up the garbage, educate people about recreating responsibly with bears. I just think the more we can get the message out, the more we can coexist with bears better. And it's not that people are purposely doing anything wrong. They just don't know, and they don't know that the one thing they might do wrong has a chain reaction effect. Like that bear maybe got into your camp spot and investigated your fire ring because you had unburnt corn or something like that. He'll return. That bear will return. So the people that are camping next to you might be surprised by a bear in their camp. So I've probably talked to this year about 521 people, I think was my official count. And this year is probably not an indicative year. Well, who knows with COVID, but there were a lot of people in the woods this year, and I was really grateful that I had the work to do. I fund it myself. Forest Service supplies a vehicle and fuel for me. So I have a little bit of, a Forest Service presence, I guess. And maybe a little respect than just Joe volunteer cleaning up garbage. But and then I raise the funds to pay me for the job. So Swan Valley Connections and Swan Valley Bear Resources pretty much handles private residences, and I handle private land, and I try and handle public land.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's super interesting. All right. I think that's all of our questions that we had.
I think one thing that I forgot to add on as far as vocations here in the valley would be education, whether through the schools or through Swan Ecosystem Center, Northwest Connections, all the various different groups like that, the education, nonprofits, that sort of thing. That's definitely, I feel like it's one of our more employment numbers, and all of that is through both the school and the various nonprofits here today anyway.
And another would be construction. There's a lot of people buying land and building very fancy houses.
Okay, I think that's every question that we had. If there's anything else you guys would like to add, you can think of anything.
I can't think of anything.
Okay.